The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Clarence's house as Camilla sat in her private sitting room, watching the droplets race down the glass. She had been queen consort for nearly 2 years now, but the weight of the crown still felt foreign on her head. The morning newspapers lay scattered across her mahogany desk, their headlines a familiar mix of praise and criticism that had become the soundtrack of her life. Her phone buzzed with a message from her private secretary. "Your Majesty, the Prince of Wales has requested a meeting this afternoon." He seemed rather urgent about it, Camilla sighed, setting down her teacup. William had been distant lately, more so than usual. Ever since the coronation, their relationship had become increasingly strained. She understood his position. He was protecting his father's legacy, his mother's memory, and his own future reign. But understanding didn't make the cold shoulders and clipped conversations any easier to bear. The door opened and Charles entered, his face drawn with worry. "Darling, have you seen the latest polling numbers?" He held up a tablet, the screen displaying charts and graphs that painted a troubling picture of public opinion. "The monarchy's approval ratings have dropped another 3 points this month," Charles continued, settling into the chair across from her. "William thinks we need to make some changes to our public approach." Camilla felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. Changes always seemed to involve her stepping back, becoming less visible or canceling her patronages. She had worked so hard to build her role, to find her place in this ancient institution that had never quite known what to do with her. "What kind of changes?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Charles hesitated, a telltale sign that the conversation was about to become difficult. "He suggested that perhaps you should reduce your public engagements for a while. Let things settle down." The words hit her like a physical blow. Reduce her engagements? She had spent decades building her charitable work, supporting causes close to her heart. The literacy programs, the domestic violence charities, the animal welfare organizations. They all depended on her patronage and support. "And what do you think?" she asked quietly, studying her husband's face. Charles looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "I think we need to consider all options. The stability of the monarchy must come first." That afternoon, William arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, his expression serious and businesslike. He had grown into his role as Prince of Wales with remarkable grace, but Camilla often missed the young man who used to laugh at her jokes and seek her advice about his children. They settled in the drawing room, the same room where she and Charles had celebrated their engagement all those years ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Stepmother," William began, using the formal address he'd adopted since becoming heir, "I think we need to have an honest conversation about the current situation." Camilla straightened in her chair, preparing herself for what was to come. "Of course, William. I'm listening." "The polling numbers are concerning," he continued, pulling out his own tablet. "Public opinion about the monarchy is at a 20-year low. The tabloids are having a field day with every misstep, every perceived extravagance. And you believe I'm responsible for this decline?" Camilla asked, her voice carefully controlled. William paused, choosing his words carefully. "I believe your presence in certain situations draws unwanted attention and criticism. The comparisons to my mother never stop, and frankly, they're damaging to the institution." There it was, the elephant in the room that had haunted their relationship for decades. Diana's shadow loomed large over everything Camilla did, every appearance she made, every charitable cause she championed. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "A strategic withdrawal from high-profile events. Let Catherine and I take the lead on major state occasions. Focus your efforts on behind-the-scenes work, the kind of patronage that doesn't attract media attention." Camilla felt something crack inside her chest. After years of criticism, years of working to prove herself worthy of her position, she was being asked to disappear into the background once again. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. William's expression hardened slightly. "I hope it won't come to that. We're family, after all. I would expect you to consider what's best for the monarchy, for my father's legacy, and for the future of the institution." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. "Comply or face the consequences, I see," Camilla said, rising from her chair. "Well, thank you for being so direct about your feelings, William. I appreciate your honesty." As William left, Camilla stood at the window, watching his car disappear down the driveway. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray and threatening. She thought about all the years she had spent trying to earn her place in this family, all the criticism she had endured, all the patience she had shown in the face of constant scrutiny. That evening, as she and Charles prepared for bed, she made a decision that would change everything. "I won't be stepping back," she told him quietly as she brushed her hair. "I've earned my place here, and I won't be pushed aside by polling numbers and political calculations." Charles looked up from his reading, concern etched across his face. "Darling, perhaps we should think about this more carefully. William has valid concerns." "William has never wanted me here," Camilla replied, setting down her brush with more force than necessary. "Nothing I do will ever be enough for him. I could cure cancer and end world hunger, and he would still see me as the woman who came between his parents. That's not fair, and you know it, isn't it?" Camilla turned to face her husband. "Tell me, Charles, when was the last time William spoke to me with genuine warmth? When was the last time he included me in family discussions without being prompted? When was the last time he defended me against media criticism?" Charles had no answer because they both knew the truth. William tolerated Camilla for his father's sake, but he had never truly accepted her as part of the family. As she lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, Camilla made a promise to herself. She would not go quietly into the background. She had spent too many years being the other woman, the scandal, the mistake. She was queen consort now, and she would act like it. What she didn't realize was that her decision to stand firm would set in motion a series of events that would shake the very foundations of the royal family, and that words spoken in anger would create wounds that might never heal. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Clarence House. Lady Sarah Chatto, Princess Margaret's daughter and one of the Queen's most trusted confidants, arrived unannounced, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of concern. "Camilla, darling," Sarah said as she was shown into the morning room, "we need to talk." Camilla set aside her correspondence, sensing the gravity in Sarah's voice. "Of course. Tea?" "Something stronger might be more appropriate," Sarah replied, settling into the chintz armchair across from Camilla. "I've just come from a rather enlightening conversation with my cousin William." The mention of William's name sent a chill through Camilla. "Oh? He's mobilizing support among the extended family," Sarah continued, her voice low and urgent. "Calling in favors, making his case for why you should step back from public duties. He's particularly focused on the working royals, Edward, Sophie, Anne." Camilla felt her blood pressure rising. "And what case is he making exactly?" Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with her role as messenger. "He's painting it as a matter of institutional survival, claims that your continued high-profile presence is damaging the monarchy's reputation and that drastic action is needed to preserve public support." "Drastic action," Camilla repeated, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "How diplomatic of him." "There's more," Sarah said, leaning forward. "He's scheduled a family meeting for this weekend at Sandringham. All the senior royals will be there, except you. The official reason is to discuss the upcoming state visit. Preparations, but my sources suggest the real agenda is building consensus around his proposal." Camilla stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The autumn garden looked particularly bleak, the trees stripped bare by recent storms. "And Charles? What does my husband say about this family conference that deliberately excludes his wife?" "That's the concerning part," Sarah admitted. "He agreed to it. William convinced him it would be better to discuss family matters without creating any awkwardness for you." The betrayal cut deep. Charles, the man who had promised to stand by her through everything, was allowing their son to orchestrate her isolation from the very family she had fought so hard to join. "I see," Camilla said quietly, her mind racing. "And you're telling me this because?" "Because I remember what it was like for my mother," Sarah replied, her voice softening. "The constant criticism, the feeling of being perpetually on trial. Margaret never quite recovered from always being seen as the spare, the problematic one. I won't watch them do the same thing to you." Over the next few days, Camilla found herself experiencing the royal equivalent of being sent to Coventry. Invitations that should have included her arrived addressed only to Charles. Phone calls went unreturned. Her private secretary reported unusual delays in confirmations for upcoming engagements. The isolation was methodical and deliberate, designed to make her feel like an outsider in her own life. But instead of weakening her resolve, it only strengthened her determination to fight back. On Thursday evening, Camilla made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and called Geordie Gregg, a journalist she had known for years and who had always been fair in his coverage of her. "Geordie," she said when he answered, "I wonder if you might be interested in an exclusive interview. I think it's time I told my side of the story." The next morning, Charles left for Sandringham, kissing Camilla goodbye with what felt like forced affection. "I'll sort this out, darling," he promised. "William just needs time to see reason." But Camilla knew better. William had made up his mind long ago, and this weekend's gathering was merely the formalization of a decision already made. She watched. Charles's car disappeared down the drive, then turned to her private secretary. "Cancel my engagements for next week," she instructed. "I'll be doing a rather important interview instead." Meanwhile, at Sandringham, the mood was tense from the moment the family gathered in the main drawing room. William had prepared extensively for this meeting, armed with polling data, media analysis, and carefully crafted arguments about institutional preservation. "The facts are undeniable," William told the assembled group, which included Charles, Anne, Edward, Sophie, and several other senior royals. "Public approval for the monarchy is at its lowest point in decades. Every major poll shows that Camilla's presence at state events generates negative sentiment." Anne, never one to mince words, leaned back in her chair. "And you believe hiding her away will solve our problems? That seems rather short-sighted." "I'm not suggesting we hide her," William replied, though that was exactly what he was proposing. "I'm suggesting we be strategic about her public role. Focus on areas where she can contribute without generating controversy." "Such as?" Edward inquired. "Private patronages, behind-the-scenes charitable work, supporting Charles in his constitutional duties without being the face of those activities." Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "William, I understand your concerns, but Camilla is my wife. She's the queen consort. We can't simply pretend she doesn't exist." "I'm not asking you to pretend she doesn't exist," William said, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. "I'm asking you to consider the greater good. The survival of the monarchy depends on public support, and that support is eroding." The conversation continued for hours, with various family members weighing in. Some supported William's position, others expressed reservations. But gradually, through sheer persistence and the weight of his future authority, William began to win the room. It was Sophie who asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "What if Camilla refuses to go along with this arrangement?" William's expression hardened. "Then we'll have to consider more serious measures. The institution must be protected even from members of our own family." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Everyone in the room understood what William was really saying. Comply, or face the consequences of opposing the future king. Back in London, Camilla was preparing for what would become the most important conversation of her royal career. Geordie Gregg had agreed to meet her the following Tuesday, and she was carefully considering how much of the truth she was willing to reveal. She had spent decades biting her tongue, accepting criticism with grace and trying to prove herself worthy of her position. But the events of recent weeks had shown her that no amount of good behavior would ever be enough for some people. As she sat in her study that evening, writing notes for the interview, Camilla made a decision that would shock the royal family and the nation. She would tell the truth, not just about her own experiences, but about the family dynamics that the palace had worked so hard to keep hidden. She began to write down the things she wanted to say, the grievances she had harbored for years, the slights and snubs that had accumulated like paper cuts over time. Some of her planned revelations were harsh, others merely honest, but all of them were potentially explosive. What Camilla didn't realize was that by choosing to fight back, she was about to say words that would create an irreparable rift in the royal family. Words that would make William's current campaign against her seem like child's play. Words that would ensure he could never forgive her, no matter what happened in the years to come. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the monarchy to its core, and Camilla had chosen to be the one to light the fuse. Tuesday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for November, as if the weather itself was holding its breath for what was to come. Camilla had chosen her private sitting room at Clarence's house for the interview, a space that felt more personal than the formal staterooms. She wanted to appear approachable, human, relatable. Everything the polling suggested she wasn't. Geordie Gregg arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, accompanied by a small camera crew and a photographer. He had known Camilla for nearly 20 years, since her days as Charles's long-suffering mistress, and he understood the significance of what she was offering. "Your Majesty," he said, settling into the chair across from her, "I have to ask, are you certain you want to do this? Once these words are spoken, there's no taking them back." Camilla smoothed her skirt, a nervous gesture left over from her pre-royal days. "I've been taking things back for 20 years, Geordie. Apologizing for existing, for loving my husband, for accepting the role I was given. I'm tired of it." The cameras began rolling, and for the first hour the interview proceeded along predictable lines. Camilla spoke about her charitable work, her pride in Charles's reign, her hopes for the future of the monarchy. She was poised, articulate, and utterly unconvincing in her enthusiasm. But then Geordie asked the question that changed everything. "Your Majesty, there have been persistent rumors about tensions within the royal family regarding your role. How do you respond to suggestions that you should step back from public duties?" Camilla paused, her carefully prepared response dying on her lips. In that moment, she made a choice that would haunt her for years to come. "You know, Geordie," she began, her voice taking on a more conversational tone, "I've spent 2 decades being told what I should and shouldn't do by people who have never walked in my shoes. I've been patient, understanding, accommodating, but there comes a point when enough is enough. Can you elaborate on that?" Camilla looked directly into the camera, speaking not to Geordie but to the millions of people who would eventually watch this interview. "I've been blamed for everything that's gone wrong with this family for 30 years. Diana's death, Charles's unpopularity, the boys' struggles growing up, somehow it's all my fault. But no one wants to talk about the real problems, do they?" Geordie leaned forward, sensing the shift in tone. "What real problems?" "The hypocrisy," Camilla said, her voice gaining strength. "The way this family eats its own when it's convenient. The way certain members manipulate situations to serve their own interests while hiding behind duty and tradition." "Are you referring to anyone in particular?" This was the moment. Camilla could feel it approaching like a train wreck in slow motion. She could still stop, still return to the safe, sanitized responses that had kept her out of trouble for so long. But the years of frustration, the recent campaign against her, the weekend meeting she hadn't been invited to, it all bubbled up at once. "William," she said quietly, and the words seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room. "The Prince of Wales has decided I'm a liability, and he's systematically working to isolate me from the family and my duties. He's using his future authority to pressure other family members into supporting his campaign against me. That's a serious allegation. Your Majesty." "It's the truth," Camilla replied, her composure beginning to crack. "And do you know why he's doing it? Not because of polling numbers or public opinion or any noble concern for the monarchy. He's doing it because he still blames me for his parents' marriage. And he's finally in a position to do something about it." Geordie knew he was witnessing something extraordinary, a senior royal breaking every unwritten rule about family loyalty and public discretion. "What evidence do you have for these claims?" "Last weekend, while I was excluded from a family meeting at Sandringham, William laid out his plan to marginalize me. He's convinced Charles that it's for the good of the monarchy, but it's really about settling old scores." The words were tumbling out now, years of suppressed resentment spilling across the perfectly appointed sitting room like wine on white linen. "And there's something else people should know about William," Camilla continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "something about how he really feels about his father." Even Geordie, seasoned journalist that he was, felt a chill at the tone in her voice. "What do you mean?" Camilla looked out the window for a long moment, as if seeing something in the distance that others couldn't. When she turned back to the camera, her expression was resolute. "William has never forgiven Charles for choosing me over Diana. But more than that, he's never forgiven him for being weak, for not standing up to the press, for not protecting his mother, for not being the father and King William needed him to be. There's a part of William that's just waiting for Charles to fail so he can step in and fix everything. Are you suggesting the Prince of Wales is disloyal to his father? I'm suggesting that William sees himself as the monarchy's savior, Camilla replied. And in his version of salvation, there's no room for me. He's told people privately that once he's king, things will be very different, that he'll restore the dignity and respect that the monarchy has lost. The implication is clear. Everything that's wrong started when his father married me. Geordie was frantically signaling his producer, knowing they were capturing television gold. Has the Prince of Wales said this directly to you? Not in so many words, but the message has been crystal clear. Just last week he told me that he hoped I would consider what was best for the monarchy and for his father's legacy. The threat was unmistakable. Fall in line or face the consequences. What consequences? Camilla's laugh was bitter and tired. Well, we're seeing them now, aren't we? The isolation, the exclusion from family events, the systematic erosion of my role and responsibilities. William is very good at making his displeasure known without having to say anything explicitly. The interview continued for another hour, with Camilla revealing detail after detail about the internal dynamics of the royal family. She spoke about feeling like an outsider at family gatherings, about conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, about decisions made about her future without her input. But it was her comments about William that would prove most devastating. With each revelation, she was painting a picture of the future king as manipulative, calculating, and driven by personal vendettas rather than duty to the crown. The tragedy is, Camilla concluded, William is a good man who would make an excellent king, but he's let his feelings about the past cloud his judgment about the present. He's so determined to right what he sees as his father's wrongs that he's creating new problems for the monarchy. As the cameras stopped rolling, Geordie sat back in his chair, visibly shaken by what he had just witnessed. Your Majesty, you realize this will cause an earthquake? I know, Camilla replied quietly, but sometimes earthquakes are necessary to shift the ground back to where it should be. What Camilla didn't realize was that her earthquake would do more than shift the ground. It would create a chasm between her and William that would never be bridged. The words she had spoken in that sitting room would echo through the palace corridors and newspaper headlines for months to come. And William, watching the interview from Kensington Palace 3 days later, would feel something inside him harden permanently against the woman his father had chosen to marry. Forgiveness would become impossible, and the royal family would never be the same. The interview aired on a Thursday evening at 9 o'clock, and by 9:15 the royal family's world had exploded. Within minutes, social media was ablaze with clips and quotes. News channels were interrupting regular programming, and journalists across the globe were frantically calling their palace contacts. William was in his study at Kensington Palace when his private secretary burst through the door, her face pale with shock. Sir, you need to see this immediately. As William watched his stepmother systematically dismantle him on national television, something fundamental shifted inside him. Each accusation, each revelation, each carefully chosen word felt like a personal betrayal that cut deeper than any public criticism he had ever faced. Catherine found him an hour later, still sitting in the dark, the television screen now blank. William, she said softly, approaching him as one might approach a wounded animal. She's declared war, he said quietly, his voice eerily calm. After everything we've done to protect this family, to protect her, she's declared war. The children will see this, Catherine said, settling beside him on the sofa. George is old enough to understand some of it. We need to think about how to handle this. William's phone had been buzzing incessantly with calls from family members, government officials, and palace staff. He ignored them all, his mind working through the implications of what Camilla had done. She's portrayed me as some kind of scheming Machiavelli, he said, finally looking at his wife. Suggested I'm disloyal to my father, that I'm manipulating the family for personal gain. She's taken every private conversation, every family concern, and weaponized it. At Clarence House, Charles was pacing his study like a caged lion, his face red with fury and embarrassment. He had returned from a state dinner to find his staff in crisis mode and his phone ringing with calls from the Prime Minister's office. How could she do this? He kept repeating to anyone who would listen. How could she betray the family like this? Camilla, meanwhile, had retreated to her private apartments and was refusing to see anyone, including her husband. She had expected backlash, but the speed and intensity of the response had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Her lady-in-waiting knocked softly on the door. "Your Majesty, His Majesty is requesting to see you." "Tell His Majesty that I'm not available," Camilla replied, her voice steady despite the chaos raging in her mind. When Charles finally confronted her the next morning, the conversation was explosive in its intensity, though conducted in the hushed tones that royal arguments always took. "You've humiliated me," Charles said, his voice shaking with controlled rage. "You've humiliated the monarchy. You've potentially damaged William's reputation irreparably." "I told the truth," Camilla replied, meeting his gaze steadily, "something this family seems to have forgotten how to do." "The truth?" Charles's voice rose slightly before he caught himself. "You made private family discussions public. You violated every principle of royal discretion. You've given our critics ammunition they'll use for years." "Our critics?" Camilla laughed bitterly. "Charles, your son has been systematically trying to destroy my position in this family. He held a meeting last weekend specifically to build support for sidelining me, and you allowed it. Where was your concern for royal discretion then?" The argument continued for over an hour, but it was clear that neither would yield. Charles felt betrayed by his wife's public revelation of private family matters. Camilla felt abandoned by her husband's failure to defend her against his son's campaign. The media response was swift and brutal. The tabloids had a field day with headlines like "Camilla's Revenge" and "Queen's War on William." Conservative commentators expressed shock at her breach of royal protocol, while others praised her for finally speaking truth to power. Most damaging were the political implications. The Prime Minister's office issued a carefully worded statement, expressing confidence in the monarchy, while clearly distancing themselves from the controversy. Opposition leaders called for a review of royal funding and responsibilities. Within the royal family, the divisions were immediate and stark. Anne publicly supported William, issuing a rare statement about the importance of family loyalty and institutional discretion. Edward and Sophie remained diplomatically silent. The extended family chose sides quickly, with most aligning themselves with the future king rather than the current queen consort. But it was the reaction from the younger generation that cut deepest. Harry, watching from California, felt a complex mix of vindication and sadness. His own criticisms of the royal family suddenly seemed prescient, but he took no joy in seeing the institution tear itself apart. William's children were perhaps the most innocent victims of the controversy. George, now old enough to understand the basics of what was happening, asked his father why Granny Camilla was saying mean things about him on television. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree about important things," William explained, kneeling down to his son's level. "But that doesn't mean we stop loving each other." Privately, however, William was discovering that love and forgiveness were very different things. The calculated nature of Camilla's attack, the way she had used private family conversations as ammunition, the damage she had potentially done to his children's future inheritance, these were not things he could simply forgive. A week after the interview, William requested a private meeting with his father. They met at Windsor Castle, on neutral ground away from the partisan atmospheres of their respective homes. "We need to discuss the future," William said without preamble as they walked through the castle grounds. "If you're asking me to choose between you and my wife," Charles replied, "I won't do it." "I'm not asking you to choose," William said carefully. "I'm telling you that I cannot and will not work with her again. Any event, any engagement, any family gathering that includes Camilla will not include me or my family." Charles stopped walking, the implications of his son's words sinking in. "William, you can't mean that." "She crossed a line that can't be uncrossed," William replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "She used privileged information to damage my reputation and position. She portrayed me as disloyal to you and manipulative toward the family. Those accusations will follow me for the rest of my life. But if you refuse to appear with her, you're confirming the division she talked about. You're proving her point." William's smile was cold and entirely without humor. "Father, she's already proven her point. The question now is how we manage the damage she's done." What followed was a painful negotiation that would reshape the royal family's public face. William would not appear at any event where Camilla had a prominent role. State occasions would need to be carefully choreographed to minimize their interactions. Family gatherings would become exercises in diplomatic scheduling. Charles, caught between his wife and his heir, found himself forced to make choices no monarch should have to make. Every decision became a calculation of competing loyalties, every public appearance a potential minefield of family politics. The monarchy, which had weathered wars and scandals and constitutional crises, found itself facing a new kind of challenge, a civil war conducted in whispers and conducted by its own members. And at the center of it all was the unforgivable sin of speaking truth in a family built on carefully maintained silence. Camilla had won her battle for public attention, but she was beginning to realize she might have lost the war for her place in the royal family. And William, watching his inheritance slowly fracture along the lines his stepmother had drawn, was discovering that some words, once spoken, could never be forgiven or forgotten. 6 months after the interview that changed everything, the royal family had settled into a new, uncomfortable normal. Public events had become elaborate choreographed performances designed to minimize interaction between William and Camilla. While private family life had essentially ceased to exist, the strain was showing on everyone, but perhaps most visibly on Charles himself. The king who had waited decades for his reign was now spending most of his time managing family conflicts rather than leading the nation. Palace staff spoke in hushed tones about his increasing irritability and the way he seemed to age years in the span of months. "It's like watching a slow-motion car crash," one senior courtier confided to another over lunch at their club. "The king is caught between impossible choices, and every decision he makes alienates someone." The Easter service at Windsor had been particularly painful to witness. The family arrived in separate cars, sat in different sections of the chapel, and left without the traditional family gathering that photographers usually captured. The absence of warmth was so obvious that even the most protocol-conscious observers were uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Camilla had discovered that winning the battle for public attention had come at a devastating personal cost. Her relationship with Charles had become formal and distant, more like business partners than husband and wife. The easy affection and private jokes that had sustained their relationship for decades had disappeared, replaced by careful politeness and strategic conversations. Her public approval ratings had actually improved following the interview. Many people admired her honesty and felt sympathy for her position. But popularity with the public meant nothing when you were isolated within your own family. The breaking point came during preparations for the Trooping the Color ceremony. Traditionally, this was the monarchy's most visible public display of unity, with the entire royal family appearing together on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. William had made it clear that he would not appear if Camilla took her expected prominent position beside Charles. Charles, equally determined not to be dictated to by his son, insisted that his wife would take her rightful place as queen consort. The standoff lasted for weeks, with various courtiers and family members attempting to broker a compromise. But both men had drawn lines they refused to cross, and neither was willing to be seen backing down. 3 weeks before the ceremony, William made a decision that shocked even his closest advisors. He announced that he and his family would be taking a private holiday during Trooping the Color weekend, effectively boycotting the most important royal event of the year. The media response was immediate and devastating. "Prince boycotts Queen," screamed the headlines. Royal commentators spoke of constitutional crisis and the potential for permanent damage to the monarchy's reputation. Charles, furious at what he saw as his son's public defiance, made his own dramatic gesture. He announced that this year's Trooping the Color would be dedicated to family unity and the strength of the monarchy, a barely veiled criticism of William's absence, but the ceremony itself was a hollow spectacle. The balcony appearance, usually filled with multiple generations of royals waving to enthusiastic crowds, featured only Charles, Camilla, and a handful of minor royals. The absence of William, Catherine, and their children was so obvious that the crowds below seemed confused and disappointed. Behind the scenes, the family was hemorrhaging support from key institutions. The Church of England, which had always maintained discreet silence about royal family matters, began expressing private concerns about the scandal's impact on the monarchy's role as moral leadership. The Archbishop of Canterbury requested a private meeting with Charles, ostensibly to discuss upcoming religious ceremonies, but really to express the Church's growing unease about the very public family divisions. Similar conversations were happening with leaders from the Commonwealth realms, many of whom were questioning whether a fractured royal family could continue to serve as an effective symbol of unity. It was during this period of maximum tension that Camilla made what would prove to be her final, fatal mistake. Speaking at a private charity dinner in July, she believed she was among friends and supporters. The event was supposed to be off the record, a safe space for honest conversation about her work with domestic violence charities. But someone in the room was recording, and Camilla's words would once again make headlines around the world. "You know," she said, her voice slightly slurred from the wine served during dinner. "People ask me if I regret speaking out earlier this year. The truth is I regret not speaking out sooner. William has been undermining me for years, whispering poison in his father's ear, turning family members against me." The recording continued for several more minutes, capturing Camilla at her most unguarded and bitter. She spoke about feeling like an outsider in her own home, about Charles's weakness in failing to stand up to his son, about her growing certainty that William was actively working to force her from the family. But it was her final comment that would prove most damaging, the words that would ensure William's hatred would last forever. "The boy has never gotten over his mother's death," Camilla said, her voice dropping to what she thought was a confidential whisper, "and frankly, neither has Charles. They both live in this fantasy where Diana was some kind of saint, when the truth is she was as manipulative and calculating as any of us. The difference is she had better publicity." The silence in the room was immediate and total. Even Camilla's most loyal supporters were shocked by the cruelty and disrespect of her words about the late Princess of Wales. Within hours, the recording was in the hands of journalists. Within days, it was playing on news channels around the world. The woman who had spent decades trying to escape Diana's shadow had just guaranteed she would never succeed. The public reaction was swift and devastating. Camilla's approval ratings, which had slowly recovered after her interview, plummeted to historic lows. Vigils appeared outside Kensington Palace, where Diana had once lived. The gates were covered with flowers and angry messages directed at the woman who had dared to criticize the people's princess. But it was William's reaction that would prove most consequential. When he heard the recording, something inside him broke completely. The careful control he had maintained for months, the diplomatic language he had used in family negotiations, the hope he had harbored that somehow they could find a way forward, all of it disappeared in an instant. That evening, he drove to Windsor Castle alone, bypassing all normal protocol to demand an immediate audience with his father. The confrontation that followed would be remembered by those who witnessed it as the moment the royal family's unity died completely. "She spoke about my mother," William said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "She called her manipulative and calculating. She mocked our grief, father. She mocked yours." Charles, who had also heard the recording, looked older than his years. "William, she was drinking. People say things they don't mean when they're—" "No," William cut him off. "This isn't about alcohol. This is who she is. This is who she's always been, and you've chosen her over your own son, over your own grandchildren, over the memory of my mother." The argument that followed was savage in its honesty. Years of suppressed resentment poured out from both men. Charles accused William of trying to destroy his marriage and undermine his reign. William accused his father of weakness and betraying everything the monarchy was supposed to represent. When William left Windsor that night, both father and son knew that something irreparable had been broken. The careful balance Charles had tried to maintain between his wife and his heir was no longer possible. Within a week, William had made a decision that would reshape the monarchy forever. In a statement released through Kensington Palace, he announced that he and his family would be taking an extended break from royal duties to focus on private family matters. The statement was diplomatic, but its meaning was clear to everyone who mattered. The future king was effectively going on strike, withdrawing his support from the monarchy until the Camilla problem was resolved. For Charles, it was the ultimate nightmare. Forced to choose between his wife and his legacy, between his personal happiness and his constitutional duty, and for Camilla, sitting in her increasingly isolated apartments at Clarence House, the full consequences of her words were finally becoming clear. She had wanted to fight back against those who tried to diminish her. Instead, she had diminished herself beyond redemption. The whispers she had intended to be private had ignited a chaos that would consume the royal family for years to come. And William, watching from Anmer Hall as his inheritance burned around him, knew that forgiveness was no longer possible. Some words once spoken poisoned everything they touched. Camilla's whispers had become a roar that drowned out any possibility of reconciliation. 1 year after Camilla's devastating comments about Diana, the royal family existed in a state of Cold War that showed no signs of thawing. The monarchy continued to function, but it was a hollow shell of its former self, propped up by tradition and protocol while bleeding legitimacy and public support. Charles had aged dramatically in the months following his confrontation with William. The king who had once radiated energy and purpose now seemed diminished, going through the motions of his constitutional duties while privately wrestling with an impossible situation. Palace staff reported that he often worked late into the night, as if staying busy could distract him from the ruins of his family relationships. Camilla had become a virtual prisoner in her own home. Public appearances were limited to the most essential constitutional duties, and even those were carefully managed to minimize negative reactions. She had stopped reading newspapers or watching news programs, but the isolation couldn't protect her from the knowledge that she had become one of the most disliked figures in British public life. The recording had done more than damage her reputation. It had revealed a side of her personality that even sympathetic observers found difficult to defend. The casual cruelty of her comments about Diana, the dismissive tone she had used when speaking about genuine grief, had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. William, meanwhile, had used his year away from royal duties to rebuild his relationship with his children and plan for a future that looked increasingly uncertain. The extended break from public life had initially been criticized, but as public opinion turned more strongly against Camilla, many began to see his absence as principled rather than petulant. His rare public statements were carefully crafted to avoid direct criticism of his stepmother while making clear his commitment to a different vision of monarchy. He spoke about transparency, accountability, and the importance of earning public trust rather than expecting it as a birthright. The pressure on Charles to resolve the crisis was immense and came from every direction. The Prime Minister had begun making carefully worded suggestions about the need for clarity in the royal family's public role. Commonwealth leaders were asking pointed questions about the monarchy's future. Even the Queen's former courtiers were privately expressing concern about the damage being done to the institution she had spent 70 years building. The breaking point came in December, during preparations for the King's second Christmas speech. For 70 years, the royal Christmas message had been a moment of national unity, when political differences were set aside in favor of shared values and common purpose. But this year, the speech became another battlefield in the family's ongoing war. Charles wanted to use the message to call for reconciliation and understanding, both within families and in the broader society. His advisors, however, worried that any mention of family harmony would seem hypocritical given the very public divisions within his own household. William, who traditionally would have been consulted about such an important speech, was conspicuously absent from the planning process. When palace officials reached out to Kensington Palace, they were told that the Prince of Wales was unavailable for consultation on royal matters until further notice. The final version of the speech was a masterpiece of careful ambiguity, touching on themes of forgiveness and renewal, without acknowledging the specific crisis that had consumed the royal family. But even this diplomatic approach couldn't hide the elephant in the room: the conspicuous absence of any reference to family unity or dynastic stability. On Christmas Day itself, the traditional church service at Sandringham became a painful reminder of how far the family had fallen. William and his family attended services at their local parish church instead, making their absence from the royal gathering impossible to ignore. The photographs from that day told the story more clearly than any words could. Charles and Camilla walked to church with only a handful of minor royals, the usual crowd of family members reduced to a small, somber group. The contrast with previous years, when multiple generations of royals had created a picture of dynastic strength, was stark and depressing. It was in the new year that Charles finally accepted what many around him had been saying for months: the situation was unsustainable. The monarchy's approval ratings were at historic lows. Political pressure was mounting, and most damaging of all, his own heir was in open rebellion against his reign. The decision, when it came, was presented as Camilla's choice. Though everyone involved understood the reality, In January, the Queen Consort announced that she would be stepping back from all public duties to focus on private charitable work and family matters. The statement was carefully worded to preserve everyone's dignity, but its meaning was clear. Camilla was being sacrificed to save the monarchy and restore Charles's relationship with his son. The public reaction was mixed. Some saw it as long overdue accountability for her divisive comments. Others viewed it as a betrayal of the woman who had stood by Charles through decades of criticism. But most people were simply relieved that the crisis might finally be ending. William's response to his stepmother's withdrawal was characteristically diplomatic. He issued a statement expressing hope for healing and renewal within the royal family, while carefully avoiding any direct comment about Camilla herself. Behind the scenes, however, those close to William knew that his stepmother's retreat from public life hadn't softened his anger. If anything, the way she had been forced from her position seemed to confirm his belief that she had never been suited for royal life in the first place. The first public reconciliation between father and son came at the Commonwealth Day service in March. William and his family appeared alongside Charles for the first time in over a year, their presence carefully orchestrated to suggest that normal family relationships were being restored. But those who knew the family well could see that the smiles were forced and the interactions stilted. The damage done by Camilla's words ran too deep for easy forgiveness, and William's return to royal duties came with unspoken conditions that everyone understood, but no one acknowledged. Camilla herself watched the service on television from Clarence House, where she now spent most of her time. The sight of her husband and stepson standing together, apparently reconciled, should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like a funeral for the life she had built over 2 decades. In the months that followed, the royal family slowly began to function again. William resumed his full schedule of royal duties, the king's public appearances became more confident, and the monarchy's approval ratings gradually improved. But the cost had been enormous. The institution that prided itself on continuity and stability had been shaken to its core by a family conflict that played out on the world stage. Trust between family members had been shattered, and the succession that should have been smooth and natural now carried the weight of unresolved resentments. For Camilla, the woman who had once dreamed of being remembered as a respected queen consort, the legacy was irredeemably tainted. She had wanted to fight back against those who tried to diminish her role, but in doing so, she had diminished herself beyond repair. And for William, who would one day inherit the crown his father wore, the lesson was clear and painful. Some words once spoken could never be forgiven. His stepmother's whispers had ignited a chaos that would cast a shadow over his own reign, a reminder that in the royal family, private grievances had public consequences, and forgiveness was a luxury they could no longer afford. The monarchy survived as it always had, but it was forever changed by the woman who had spoken truths that should have remained unspoken, and by the prince who had learned that love and forgiveness were sometimes mutually exclusive concepts.